I'm Brian Shifman, the President and CEO of the Vaughan Chamber of Commerce. Pleasure to have you here with us this morning from your living rooms, for those who can be in your offices, from your kitchens. The Vaughan Chamber, as you know, we've been doing a series of business resource segments as well as virtual town halls. We've tried to provide some reassurance to our business members as to what's happening out there, how to navigate this pandemic. We've certainly seen themes early on. It was obviously liquidity crunch and cash flow, a lot of concerns about your employees. As we went along, a lot of discussion about commercial rent assistance. And we saw those programs evolve, the wage subsidy as well as the rental assistance. And now I'd say broadly, the big topic is really how do we reopen safely and responsibly while following government regulations and protecting the health and safety of our customers and our employees. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by two excellent guests. We have MP Sorbara, Francesco Sorbara, coming back. I think this is the third time you're joining us, and I really appreciate the candor that you apply to these sessions. And given your background as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue and your involvement with Vaughan Woodbridge as an MP, it's good to have you discussing economic issues. In a moment, I'm going to get you to introduce our other special guests. Very important discussion today. We're talking about the future of the Canadian economy, where we're headed, as well as the global economy more broadly. So, and all I'd add to this is that after we do some introductions, we're going to have a good Q&A, a lot of different topics discussed. Remember, you can get all the government supports being provided by all levels of government on the Vaughan Chamber website. And with that, I'd just like to thank you, MP Sorbara, for helping us bring on a Deputy Chief Economist of Scotiabank, Brett House, and really appreciate you coming on. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to introduce, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Vaughan Chamber of Commerce again for providing a great platform for, in this very unique and extraordinary time, a great platform for many of its stakeholders to get information on programs. I know we've had a couple of discussions, Brian, with the Vaughan Chamber, many of its members needing information on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, Canada Emergency Business Account, just two programs that we put in place to help businesses out across the country, and here with over 12,000 SMEs here in the city of Vaughan, obviously trying to navigate this new world that we're in. My commentary is going to be very limited. I'm going to turn it over to the Deputy Chief Economist, Brett House, a friend over at Scotiabank. The only thing I will, before I do that, I'd like to just say is that I know the quickest way to get an economic recovery happening is for us to be able to open up in a safe manner, in a manner that is that people can feel confident in, and the businesses can feel confident in. And the other note is that here in Vaughan, we're blessed with being a hub, as I call it, and this is for Brett's detail too. We have the logistics facilities of UPS, Costco, FedEx, the busiest intermodal facility in the country with CP Rail, CN's McMillan Yard, the largest rail facility in Canada, all located here in the city of Vaughan. A number of manufacturers. So we know Canada is a trading country. And also getting that part of the economy up and running again, I think, is going to be crucial for us to have a sustained and robust economic recovery. So without further ado, I'm going to stop there. Those are my humble thoughts, and I'd like to turn it over to Brett House, Deputy Chief Economist at the Scotiabank. And I thank you, Brett, for availing yourself this morning for Vaughan's business community.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak with you today. It is a real pleasure to review some of our thoughts on the economic outlook, particularly given, as you mentioned, MP Sorbara, Vaughan is a real heart of the Canadian economy in terms of both domestic and international trade, transportation, and logistics that keep both Southern Ontario and really the entire country alive. It's no news to anyone that the second quarter of this year is seeing really extreme downturns in almost every major economy, both in the developed world and in the emerging world. And there are many aspects of this recession that are truly distinct. The word unprecedented gets used too often, but there are ways in which the current moment really does justify it. It's the first time that we've had a synchronized downturn across almost every major economy in the world. In the past, if we think of 2008, the recession that took hold then as a result of the financial crisis in the United States and then Europe was limited principally to industrialized or relatively wealthy economies. Emerging and frontier economies did relatively better. If we think back to the early 2000s and the dot-com bust, there was a downturn in developed markets, but that was accompanied by a debt crisis in many emerging markets that was far more profound. This time around, what the IMF has referred to as the Great Lockdown, as a bookend to the Great Depression in the 1930s, truly is synchronized across all the world's major economies. No one is immune from it. And it is also unprecedented in its speed. Normally, a downturn on an economy takes 4 to 6 months, 4 to 6 quarters, I should say, to play out. This time around, we have compressed the full onset of a recession into a single quarter in Q2, which should see, by most estimates and forecasts, the single biggest downturn in economic activity in every major economy that we have recorded since the 1930s. What is distinct and where a lot of discussion has centered is on what the recovery from this downturn is likely to look like. And you've probably seen discussion by folks like myself around different letter metaphors that could capture what the profile of the rebound might be shaped like. You've seen a lot of discussion of whether it will be a V-shaped recovery, meaning a quick downturn and a very quick recovery, something more like a U where we muddle along a little while before we see a bit of a rebound, or what some have called an L-shaped recovery, adapted to Canada, a hockey stick recovery for the United States, a Nike swoosh, where that quick downturn in the second quarter is followed by a relatively slow rebound. Now, I think it's worth distinguishing to make sense of that discussion between the profile of growth rates and the profile of economic activity that is going on. There's no question that on either measure, the downturn has been immediate and sharp. But if we look at growth rates, particularly when we compare activity to a year before, year-on-year growth, we are likely to see a V-shaped rebound in growth rates where the roughly 9% contraction in the Canadian economy that we are currently forecasting for this year is followed by a 6.5% rebound, which is a far stronger growth rate than we've seen at any point in the last few decades. That's relatively easy to achieve, though, when you're building off a low base, which is what 2020 is going to represent. So 2021 and possibly 2022 are going to see high growth rates, but they're not going to feel particularly great because the total level of economic activity isn't likely to follow that V-shaped recovery. It is likely to be something closer to that hockey stick or L shape, where by our estimates and forecasts, we don't expect the level, the total size of the Canadian economy and the activity in it to return to the size that we saw at the end of 2019 until sometime in the first half or so of 2022. What that means is that despite the incredible speed and breadth by which support has been delivered by federal and provincial governments to households and businesses, we are going to see some fall through the cracks. There's almost no way to get this perfect, and the lockdown is going to be lifted in all likelihood in phases that will impose different durations of pain for different sectors and different households. And as several chief medical officers have pointed out, we have never had a pandemic where there hasn't been a second wave. So this is not going to be a straight line process. It is likely that even as we reopen, there's going to be some reclosing again, back and forth, and we're going to move in fits and starts. What that means is that there's going to be substantial slack or unused capacity in the Canadian economy for some time. And even as growth starts to rebound in the second half of this year and into 2021, we anticipate that the Bank of Canada will not need to look at raising its policy interest rates until sometime well into 2022. Nevertheless, you are likely to see market interest rates bid up ahead of that, just as we've seen the stock market rally in anticipation of growth at the end of this year and next year. You're likely to see yield curves, which represent the full sweep of interest rates from short-term to longer-term rates, begin to steepen later this year and into next year. So the cost of borrowing at very long maturities is likely to start rising next year in anticipation of policy rates going up in 2022. So the general view on the economic outlook we have is one that is going to be probably a bit slower to recover than the markets, equity markets particularly, are implying right now, despite the incredible bridging that policy is providing both from the Bank of Canada and governments to keep interest rates low and to keep credit markets working and to put money directly into business and households' pockets. Some other forces that we're watching closely, of course, are discussions about the obituary for globalization. Canada, as MP Sorbara mentioned, is a trading economy, and we are incredibly dependent upon a rules-based international system that keeps tariffs low and access to markets high. I think that the death knell that is being sounded for globalization is vastly overdone. It will not be the case that globalization remains in place simply, by some inevitability. It requires all of our support and our governments to act expeditiously, as Canada has, on ensuring that markets stay open. But even as we've seen some retreat from trade in goods, I think it's worth noting that trade in services continues to reach all-time global highs, and the ineluctable logic of globalized, diversified supply chains will continue to exert themselves, and I think tip us toward continued globalization going forward. For the Canadian economy, one important thing to watch is the extent to which we are able to resume the high levels of immigration that we've seen in recent years, and the government's policy of moving to even higher target levels this year, next year, and the year after. That will be a critical issue for real estate and housing markets in the GTHA and other major cities in Canada, and for growth more broadly. Canada is the only G7 country that has seen increases in population growth rates over the last 4 years, and 75% of that growth comes from immigration. So the imperative to not only continue accepting applications as Immigration Canada has, but get to a point where we are comfortable reopening to new arrivals in a substantial way will be a major determinant of economic activity going forward. So with that, I look forward to a discussion with all of you. Those are the sort of big lines in the economic outlook that we're monitoring. And I would say in advance that Scotia is really here to be your partner navigating these difficult times. All of our research is available on our public website. It's tweeted, and we can also arrange to have it sent to you directly. And of course, we're available for conversations after this. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. That was a very good capturing of the overall condition that we're in and what you're expecting. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail with some of those topics, and we'll also turn to MP Sorbara shortly. Maybe we'll just start at the top. Like you were saying, the thing that I wrote down that I found really jarring was that you said normally a downturn takes 4 to 6 quarters, and this time we saw it in one. When chief economist, deputy chief economist, when you're working with other economists and you're looking at a downturn that's come so rapidly, how do you even approach this in terms of like your predictive model for where we're going? Because to your point, you said there's going to be substantial slack, excess capacity in the market. It's not a straight line. So I guess, is this, when you're looking at this, like what's your methodology from a bank's perspective in terms of knowing that there's so many moving parts? How do you factor those in when you're talking to your clients?
Well, we base all of our forecasts on a fairly substantial and rigorous model that was developed by my colleagues René Lalonde and Nikita Pervalov, who were key leaders in the research department of the Bank of Canada for many years and were instrumental in the development and implementation of the bank's forecasting models. And so when we generate forecasts, we are looking at the data and the way we put that data together to divine what we think lies over the horizon in a way that's very similar to what the Bank of Canada does. That said, in the Bank of Canada's recent monetary policy report, where they lay out their anticipation of where things are going to develop, they took a pass on providing a baseline set of forecasts. They argued that there was so much uncertainty around the pandemic, the public health response, and the possible lockdowns related to it that they deferred on making a clear set of projections. What they did do, though, is provide an upside and a downside scenario with projections attached to them with a pretty wide lane in between. And it turns out that our baseline forecast ends up moving more or less close to the average between those two scenarios. So we think it comes close to reflecting what the Bank of Canada is anticipating. That said, in the last few days, Governor Colas gave a speech at the University of Alberta where he argued that folks on Bay Street, like myself, are too pessimistic and that he's anticipating a better restart and rebound to the economy than we have programmed in. I think part of this difference in view may be related to our assumptions and our projections on the extent to which we lose some productive capacity in the downturn. We have seen about 18 to 20% of Canada's productive capacity knocked out of action in Q2. It is hard for us to believe that some of that won't be permanently lost. And that sounds like a very abstract idea. And I want to drill down on that and say very clearly that means small and medium sized businesses going bankrupt. That means households going insolvent and not being able to meet their bills. That's not a set of numbers. Those are real people. But those real people imply then a bit of a dampening on the potential growth that we can see going forward over the next year and a half or so that is likely to be lower than it otherwise would have been. It's just very hard for us to be quite as rosy as the Governor of the Bank of Canada when you knock out a fifth of the economy from activity. Restarting that, while in theory should be straightforward, we think in practice is going to be a little tougher.
And to your point, I see the recent earnings reports from a number of the banks coming out with significant provisions for credit losses. And in the same way, I saw an article that you put out by some of your colleagues recently saying that maybe the concern about the housing market, that we're going to see so many people have to sell their homes because they become insolvent, maybe that's overblown. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll take that in reverse. So my colleagues René Lalonde and Jean-François Perrault did a very nice paper, which is available on our website, and I can send to you, where they attempt to model from a very top-down perspective, from an economy-wide perspective, not looking at a specific market like Vaughan versus Markham or Etobicoke versus Scarborough, but from a Canada-wide perspective, what is likely to happen to housing markets and real estate in the aggregate. And their model suggested that on average, we're likely to see about an 8% downturn in prices over the course of this year, but a relatively quick rebound as reopening proceeds going into next year, largely because we faced, before the beginning of the lockdown, a very strong gap between demand for housing and available supply in Canada. And that's why I highlighted how important it is, not just from a business perspective, but from a household perspective too, to really follow what happens on immigration and the extent to which we are able to reopen and restart those inflows. Applications are being received, so the federal government is putting itself in a position to flick that switch back on as soon as possible. But that's really critical to that modeling about real estate prices. We only get, a relatively shallow downturn in real estate prices and a relatively decent pickup back to their underlying trend next year if we are able to restart immigration again, because it is so essential to the Toronto and Vancouver markets. Toronto and Vancouver broadly get about 60% of all newcomers to Canada each year. And I'm talking about the metro areas in both cases, or greater urban areas. If we aren't able to restart immigration, then the assumptions underpinning that modeling start looking a little different and probably imply a somewhat sharper downturn and potentially a more elongated recovery. But it's still based in prior conditions that saw a very big shortfall in real estate supply for the demand that we saw leading into the crisis. So luckily, we're in a very different circumstance from the late 80s when supply had run well ahead of demand, and absorbing all that excess supply took about 7 years in the Toronto area. So we came into this with different circumstances than we did previously.
Thank you for that. You know what I'll do is, well, actually, I did want to thank you for explaining the methodology of and the thinking behind some of the forecasts, because it is one of the questions that our members ask us is how are those forecasts put together. I want to turn to MP Sorbara for a moment. I mean, given your background in banking, I could pepper you with banking questions, but I'm going to focus more on the government stimulus questions, but you feel free to take it where you want. Well, let's talk about the Canada Employee Wage Subsidy. It was extended. It was originally June and now extended through August. Do you anticipate, like, given what we're seeing in the economy right now and the struggles that businesses are having, do you anticipate needing to continue to extend that program or make any further modifications to it?
Oh, I think good. It's a great question, Brian. And I think the extension to the end of August of the CEWS is something that was the right decision to make, independent of the party in power. So I give kudos to the Prime Minister and to folks on the team where I provided feedback on many of the programs directly to individuals there and say, we need to expand eligibility, for example, on the Canada Emergency Business Account, where we expanded eligibility includes self-proprietors, sole proprietors, people that pay themselves in dividends. They may not be showing that the T4 statement or the showing the level of payroll that was sufficient. So we're allowing them to demonstrate the expenses they incur, and that's a lot of businesses here in the city of Vaughan. So the point there is, when we've put in place programs, it's a very iterative process in place, if I can pronounce that word correctly, this morning, where there's a lot of feedback given back to members of parliament, from stakeholders, from the Vaughan Chamber, from CFIB, and we take that feedback back to the Department of Finance, National Revenue, so forth. So with that, we continually do that. And on the CEWS, whether it will be extended or not, I think what we're going to have to pay attention to is how the economy is doing. How are businesses doing? Are they being able to recover? Is the economy opening up? Because the last thing we want to do is going to Brett's comment, is that 18 to 20% of productive capacity that is offline. We don't want to capture more of that in terms of being permanently offline. If there are programs in place that we can get those businesses up and running and have them make sure that there is that bridge built to the other side, because it is about building a bridge to the other side, then we'll do so. I think on the CEWS, great decision. On some of the other programs, it's kind of stay tuned. Let's see how the economy goes in terms of getting more feedback back to the government in terms of whether we need to extend other programs or not. And we can go from there. I think it all also depends, Brian, on how quickly we can get the economy restarted and getting those small business owners back to getting back to work. But I'd like to just throw out a question to Brett as well. In terms of the labor slack that's going to exist in the economy for a while, how would you recommend to either have those folks retrained, retransitioned? I think that's going to be a big discussion in place. Before COVID-19, there were hundreds of thousands of positions still available in Canada. Labor needs here in York region, and we had an unemployment rate of around 4%, Brian, I think even below. And we really needed workers. And now there's an opportunity out of this to hopefully, maybe have some folks retrain, enter new careers. How important is that going to be? Because the immigration story is a great story. I'm all for it. At the same time, if you have excess capacity on the labor side, you want to make sure you have programs in place to that they can transition to new sectors of the economy.
Well, I think a lot of the demand for labor is going to be contingent on how the reopening process proceeds, how quickly we succeed in getting vaccine and treatment options in place around COVID-19, and the extent to which businesses that require in-person engagement that don't allow for physical distancing in a substantial way are able to resume activity. At the same time, obviously, for big parts of the Canadian populace, we've seen a lot of activity move online, and there is going to be a critical need to assist small and medium-sized enterprises in opening up online portals, so that we're not all reduced to doing business with Amazon or other big behemoths in the retail sector. And so that adaptation process is going to be one that will be likely to see demand for new positions and new employment. We're also going to see, in all likelihood, some flattening or redistribution of where jobs can take place. The incredible speed with which many companies have moved substantial shares of their workforce online and remotely means that rather than having to live, in the center of the GTHA, you can live on the periphery and do your job and potentially go into work 1 day a week. Or, we will see a movement of people and jobs to more remote and rural areas, and opportunities spread more effectively as a result. So, there is going to need to be a nimbleness in the economic and job training policies that are brought forward to help smooth some of that transition. And moving people to new careers, we know, is never an easy process. It takes far longer than we usually anticipate. And so work on that now, just as, I understand Catherine McKenna, the Minister of Infrastructure, is working on, projects to drive the recovery on the infrastructure side. Thinking about that is going to be critical to get ahead of it.
Well, maybe I want to go back to Brett for a second, just to talk about the provisions for credit losses. Think about those that the banks are putting forward, and you think about those in the context of what MP Sorbara is bringing up in terms of how to retrain people. And I guess the overall perspective is, if you have excess capacity in the market, you may need, if you have challenges with employees, you may need to extend government programs. Conversely, I guess it's going to depend how accurate the provisions for credit losses really turn out to be, because to me, those are an indicator of where we're going in terms of economic growth. Can you speak broadly to the provisions for credit losses broadly across the sector, not specific to your bank?
Well, one of the things that changed as a result of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 is that accounting standards were altered to ensure that financial institutions are now required to incorporate forward-looking information or projections and forecasts about where the economy is going into the process of setting aside funds to cover potential credit losses. So, the increase in provisions for potential losses on their lending portfolios now look a bit different than they might have a decade ago, because they are forced to incorporate possible stress rather than just incipient or actual stress in their lending books. So, when you see these provisions for credit losses going up, they are reflecting the kind of projections that we're making in the economic research part of the bank about that relatively slow recovery in economic activity that we could see ahead, and the difficulties that may be presented by getting some households and businesses bridged through the lockdown and the ensuing weakness in economic activity. So, in some ways, the credit loss provisioning that we see is really incorporating what could be, a relatively negative scenario, and there's a lot of room for things to go better than that, depending on how effective the Bank of Canada and federal government's policies prove in being, depending on how quickly we're able to reopen major parts of the economy and actually avoid a re-lockdown. Also, we are seeing creative deferral processes. Banks are working, with their clients to ensure that we're not looking at default situations, but are instead reprogramming or reprofiling amounts falling due during the lockdown and rescheduling them. And so that collaborative process, I think, means that the provisioning that we're seeing now is not entirely indicative of where we think the health of the Canadian economy is likely to go over the next few years.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, you're right. Hopefully, it turns out better than predicted right now. MP Sorbara, yesterday we had the Mary Ng, we had the Minister of Small Business federally on for a virtual town hall. And I'm going to ask you the same question I put to her, just for a different audience today. And it really is about bridging the gap between where we are now to where we're trying to get to and help businesses, whether it's the wage subsidy or different programs. So this is about the commercial rental assistance.
Yes.
Whether we have concerns about granted, I understand the applications only opened up yesterday for landlords to apply, but just based on what we're hearing, we clearly want to see landlords and tenants at the table together having these discussions. And are you concerned that there isn't enough opt-in anticipated from landlords? And in which case, do you expect to be making any changes to the program to help bridge the gap for tenants?
Okay. No, a great question, Brian. I've spoken to a lot of landlords here in the GTA, and for the most part, I would say for the majority of them, they're actually being quite understanding with the situation that we're in. Whether it's offering deferrals to their tenants, forgiving 50% of rent, so forth. So there's a lot of landlords. I'd say a majority of them understand the situation we're in and have been quite constructive with the landlord-tenant relationship. I think at the end of the day, they full well know that it's better to have something rented in 3 or 4 months than to have it for lease, and to work with their tenant. I also think there's a real difference in terms of when we look at tenants out there. In your local butcher shop and the demand they're seeing, or in your local strip mall plaza here in York Region, which we find everywhere, where are the businesses that are open, your McDonald's, your Tim Hortons, are seeing a flow of traffic, your Longos, so forth, versus a business that's located within a mall, call it Vaughan Mills or Yorkdale. You have different things going on, different business levels of activities going on in different areas. And I think the nimble landlords really understand that they need to work with their tenants on that level. As for the rental program, I have heard the concerns brought forth by many landlords on the complexity of the program, so forth. It is a good program. Obviously, I'd like to get more feedback on how we can improve it. If landlords don't, it's not under obligation, and we have to remember that landlords aren't under obligation to enter into an agreement with their tenants, and B, it is jurisdiction contract law under the provincial government as well. So there is that, but we're there again, almost fully backstopping 75% of the program, so people can find relief. And what I would say with that is, if landlords and tenants can come to go that way. The other option from the CECRA is also the Canada Emergency Business Account, and that has been taken up by almost, I think, it's 650,000 businesses in Canada to date, without the new one, the expanded eligibility, because that portal still has to open. So let's assume another 100 or 200,000 businesses. That 40,000 for your small, medium-sized businesses, in my plaza, paying $4,000 or $5,000 rent, or $3,000, that can be in a very effective vehicle to cover your rent for 3 or 4 months until you're able to reopen. And then with part of that program being $10,000 forgivable, it's a very powerful instrument to help businesses out during this extraordinary time. Yes, CMHC is there to assist on the CECRA. Yes, the program, I think, we're going to see from after the first couple of days who has or how many applicants we have. It really is in the interest of tenants and landlords to work together to come to a conclusion where they can help each other out to make that bridge to where we need to go. The secret's up there for 3 months. That's the initial thing, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Is ultimately we want to have the landlords and tenants talking together, both at the table. And for those, we have a lot of both as members of our community and members of the chamber. And my message would be that it is a complex program. So if you do have questions or concerns, it does have a lot of promise. Please reach out to us at the Vaughan Chamber, and we'll express those levels of government, or reach out directly to you, MP Sorbara.
Yeah, absolutely. And Brian, there is a feedback mechanism for tenants and landlords to provide feedback on the secret loan, which I encourage everyone to do. And again, on the CEBA loan, the secret rent agreement, but on the CEBA loan, we're well over 600,000 businesses that have picked up that $40,000 and received it within a matter of 3 to 5 business days, for the most part.
Well, actually, on the CEBA loan, I mean, that's been one that Chamber Network has been very supportive of. Can you talk about the expansion of the program and who it applies to now?
Absolutely. Just from a very high level, think of a hair salon. A hair salon owner will pay rent every month to a landlord, but they won't have a traditional salary structure because they'll rent chairs to their other barbers or hairdressers. So when the threshold was put in place of, I think originally it was 40,000, then brought down to 20,000 or 50 to 20,000, the hair salon owner would not have documents showing that he or she is running a business to meet that threshold. Or if you've put in place a shareholder loan to start your business up and you're paying yourself dividends, again, the CEBA loan, the original structure that over 600,000 businesses have applied for and successfully received, again, they would not be excluded. Or your local gym owner, paying his employees or contract employees, again, you're not going to meet that threshold of 20,000, although you're incurring rent and all the utilities and property taxes, insurance, and so forth to maintain your place of business. So with much feedback from MPs like myself and across the country, there are a number of us very vocal saying, hey, we have to recognize there are different business structures in place in Canada than your traditional employer-employee relationship where they get a T4 and pays, your EI and CPP. There are literally hundreds of thousands of contract workers across this country, including those that rent a barber chair or a hair salon chair. In order to save those jobs, we got to help out the owners. And in a CEBA expanded loan allows us to do that, and I think the uptake once that expanded portal is open will be quite robust.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to come back to Brett.
Follow on.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Brian, I was just going to say, the example of the barbershop or hair salon is a really opposite one because, it points to how a one-size-fits-all approach on any of these supports to the Canadian economy is rarely sufficient. And, as a result, the federal government and provincial governments, if you think about the daily announcements they've brought forward over the last few months during the pandemic, have been very open to iterating, to fixing, changing, improving, complementing the things that they brought forward quickly in order to make sure that they work for the sectors, the businesses, and the people that they're trying to help. And so, what I would really encourage members of the chamber to do, if any aspect of the existing policy quiver is not working for them, if there are tweaks that need to be made, if there are shifts in eligibility criteria or the way in which support is provided that need to be brought forward in order to make those policies work for them, they should be very vocal in talking to people like MP Sorbara and talking to other political representatives and to Ottawa directly, because I think ears are open and everyone wants to help. And if they're not getting it right, then they want to know. And we've seen consistently over the last few months how in response to input like that, policies have been improved, changed, expanded, additional things have been added on. And so don't don't suffer in silence, I think, is the most important message there.
I absolutely agree with you. I think this is our 12th or 13th segment, and I think every segment we've commented that government at all levels has been actually incredibly receptive to the feedback from the Chamber Network and our partners. We have been involved in aspects of and advocating for the wage subsidy and CEBA, as well as the rental assistance. And I agree with you. There's been a lot of iterations, and government's been receptive, and the members have been quite vocal, and we've come back with concerns and further possible improvements. And in many cases, those have happened. So I guess on that question then, are there vulnerable sectors of the economy that you think the government will need to step in to support more fully going forward?
I think some of the biggest challenges still reside with the small and medium-sized enterprise sector, particularly in things like leisure, recreation, hospitality, food and beverage, and small retailers that don't have online presences and, have maybe, are in malls, haven't been able to open yet because they don't have a curbside entrance. Those are going to be some of the areas going forward that are probably going to need continued support. I grew up in the Niagara region in Vineland, just west of St. Catharines. I know that winemakers and the hospitality industry there are suffering really heavily. And I think as a result, as you've seen discussed by Premier Ford, we're likely to see not only continued and new forms of financial support, but ongoing changes in the regulatory environment to try to make business work more easily for sectors that are having particularly hard times. There's been some musing about continued sale of alcoholic beverages and delivery from restaurants and cafes, and those kinds of shifts going forward. Those sorts of tweaks, changes, modifications in not just financing programs, but in the regulations that apply to different business sectors, are things that, if you see gaps that need to be addressed or changes that would make your life easier, be vocal about them. You know your business better than anyone else. You are experts, unlike anyone else can be, and they can't help if they don't know where some of those pain points are.
That's a good point. Before COVID-19, the Chamber Network was pretty vocal on, especially in Ontario, the amount of red tape, and was working with the government on cutting red tape for particular industries. And it's a fair point, is that cutting it now can help certain sectors in terms of their recovery. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. I wanted to ask you, one of my favorite topics is about equity markets. You did touch on it in your intro. Do you think equity markets are behaving in a way that is overly optimistic, or is really realistic of future earnings growth?
Yeah, I've had that question several times. What gives with this gap that's developing between Wall Street, as some have said, or Bay Street, and the performance of stock markets, and the evident pain that we still see for small and medium-sized businesses, for households in communities all across the country, here and in the United States. I think the thing to keep in mind is that stock market prices are reflecting where investors think that things are going to go over the next year to 2 years. They don't reflect conditions right now. They also reflect the fact that money has to be invested in many contexts, and stocks in some ways represent the most hopeful alternative compared with bonds, where yields are very low, compared with things like real estate or other less liquid investment options where uncertainty is a great deal higher. One of the other things to keep in mind, so money is going in a relative term into equity markets versus other assets. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of that move in equity markets has been driven by the tech sector, by businesses that are online that have done relatively well, by things like the supermarket sector that's seen a huge boost. In the latest data in Canada, they're up 28% over the previous year in the same period. So, the gains in equity markets are not evenly distributed. They're reflecting, those sectors that are doing well as a result of the changes in how we operate under the pandemic. But there are lots of sectors that are not seeing those kinds of gains too.
And just MP Sorbara, given your background in banking, did you want to touch on that one too, or I got other questions for you, but just in case you want to.
No, if I could accurately forecast the equity markets with over a greater 50% probability, I think I'd be doing another career right now. Than this. No, it's I think what we want to see is the economy open up. I think if you look at, there are certain industries, for example, called the chemistry industry in Canada, the petrochemical industry, where demand for products such as plastics and chloralkalis are obviously very, very robust. And then you look at other sectors of the economy, say the automotive industry, where obviously the annual SAR rate for automobiles is quite has been impacted quite negatively, and will take time to rebound. So, when if you want to go bottom up or top down in terms of how forecasters do their forecast for an equity index, there's a lot to consider these days. Obviously, some components of some indexes, for example, here in Canada, Shopify has done quite well. It's I think, Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, either the highest or
I think it has the highest market cap.
Market cap, even above Royal Bank or Scotia now. And it's an online retailer, very innovative, of course, and Canadian. Very proud to say it's Canadian. So a lot of stuff happening there. I think I would like to just comment on the thing. Obviously, Brett, you mentioned about the Bank of Canada forecast that Scotia has, not the BOC not moving until 2022. Potentially market-based rates driven by the bond market. How long do you foresee the Bank of Canada continuing its QE policy in terms of ensuring that credit markets are functioning, and all the policies they put in place to ensure that that the economy can reopen smoothly, and credit markets are continuing to function, and liquidity continuing to be provided to businesses?
Well, just to give some context, MP Sorbara asked about QE, or quantitative easing, that the Bank of Canada is engaged in. And so to unpack that a little bit first, that refers to the actions by some central banks in the wake of the 2008-2009 crisis, where they not only brought their policy interest rates down, they also went into debt markets and bought, in some cases, a range of different type of debt instruments, bonds, in order to ensure that the interest rate or yield on those bonds would remain relatively low, both at short-term maturities and at longer-term maturities. Now, you probably know, and we've talked about a lot, how Canada had a relatively good crisis, 2009-10. We didn't have the major downturn in our economy that was seen in some other countries. And as a result, the Bank of Canada didn't engage in asset purchases at that time in order to keep yields low in credit markets. And that was in part because we actually saw large inflows of foreign capital into Canada that kept the cost of borrowing down, because Canada was one of the few national governments that continued to maintain a AAA credit rating with very low debt levels. And as a result, that set a benchmark that meant interest rates for business stayed relatively low as well. This time around, the depth and the speed of the downturn is so much bigger than in 2009, not only in Canada, but in the rest of the world, that the Bank of Canada has now joined other central banks in engaging in purchases of various debt instruments in order to keep their yields or interest rates down. And that's been important and a big change from post-2008, because we saw in the United States, for instance, that when the US Fed, their central bank, bought various kinds of debt, they focused mainly on buying government bonds in order to keep the interest rate on US Treasuries down, in the hope that then, by extension, that would keep market interest rates relatively low for businesses that went into debt markets, either to get financing through selling bonds or taking out loans. That proved to be slightly imperfect. You got some of that trickle into various credit markets, but to some extent it didn't. So this time around, the Fed and the Bank of Canada, learning from the Fed's experience, have both moved to buy a range of different debt instruments, from very short-term commercial paper to longer-term sovereign bonds, to bankers' acceptances, and even in Canada, provincial debt, in order to keep the cost of borrowing for the provinces relatively low. And so what you see this time around is that the decrease in interest rates that central banks have brought in is being transferred through different credit markets to a range of borrowers, not just at Bay and King, but down on Main Street too. And you've seen mortgage rates as a result come down by almost a full percentage point in only a few months on the typical 5-year term rate.
Okay. Now I wanted to, just with the time we have left, I want to go with you, Brett, talk about global trade and our impacts, our relationship with the U.S. economy as well. So let's start broadly. You did mention again in your intro, global trade is very important for the Canadian economy, especially with our partner in the U.S. How do you expect, or how do you anticipate this pandemic will impact global trade for us in the intermediate future and longer term?
Well, I think in the short term, there has been, leading up to the pandemic, a real retreat from open and free trade by the United States. Under the current administration in the White House, it isn't news to anyone that there have been a number of protectionist measures put into place, whether it's the limits on Canadian steel and aluminum and Mexican steel and aluminum that were put forward as a bargaining chip in the revision of NAFTA. The revision of NAFTA itself, which was a solution in search of a problem. NAFTA was functioning incredibly well. All the rhetoric from the White House that says it was a terrible deal and that it was broken is patently false. There are some parts of the agreement that were due for updating, but in the 24 years that the agreement has been in place, it's been gradually updated for things like rise in services trade, digital trade, on a regular basis. So it's not like it was a 23, 24-year-old agreement that had become outdated and obsolete and needed a full overhaul. The small changes that were brought into it that keeps most of NAFTA in place mean that the 98 to 99% of trade between Canada and the United States that proceeds on a tariff-free basis will continue. But on a global level, you've seen attacks by the United States on the World Trade Organization. You've seen the continued tension with China. You've seen threats of tariffs with Europe. And in some ways, Canada is well positioned for this retreat from liberal internationalism by the United States, because we're the only G7 country that has free trade agreements with all other 6 members of the G7. We have free trade agreements that span the Pacific and the Atlantic and into Latin America. And we are continuing to optimize the implementation of those agreements and expand them. We are moving forward as a country with negotiations on a collective free trade agreement with Pacific Alliance countries, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. We've joined with our partners under the Trans-Pacific Partnership in an agreement to ensure that supply chains remain open. There is likely to be continued discussion around securing national sources of things like PPE, protective personal equipment for healthcare workers. That conversation shouldn't be confused with what will remain, I think, for Canada, a commitment to globalization and free trade that ensures what is a relatively small population can produce and punch well above its weight in terms of economic impact and do so efficiently and effectively. And that's going to rest on continued pursuit of free trade.
So does that mean that, how in lockstep do we need to be then with the U.S. Fiscal and monetary policy, given our close relationship? Because granted, we're talking about the various trade agreements we have internationally, but clearly the majority of our trade is with the U.S. So do we need to be in lockstep with them on fiscal and monetary policy?
Well, we're doing similar things to the United States because we're facing similar challenges. We've locked down the economy just as the United States has. So we've seen, a huge easing in monetary policy, an immediate drop in interest rates. Those interventions in asset markets that the Bank of Canada is doing mirror what's happening with the Fed. We are a bit distinct from the United States, and we anticipate a deeper downturn this year and a shallower recovery next year because we have a triple whammy hitting us, not just a double whammy. We have COVID-19, we also have a global oil price war, and because we are dependent on the United States, we have a delayed effect from reduced demand in the US that will hurt our demand for exports of goods and services. So, we do have some distinct challenges, but we also have some similarities, and I expect that we'll continue to develop and implement policy in a way that is broadly similar but pays attention to those challenges that are distinct and different in Canada.
Fair enough. And do you think we should be expecting what some economists have predicted, a 60-cent Canadian dollar versus the US?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. And the economists who are anticipating that kind of exchange rate are also the ones who have projected 10 of the last 20 recessions. They have been permanently bearish on not just the Canadian but global economy for much of the last decade and have been consistently incorrect. Now, it is entirely possible we could go to 60, largely if the oil price war intensifies again. But on current circumstances and the outlook that we have, we would anticipate the Canadian dollar to probably remain in the low 70-cent range against the US dollar over the next year to 2 years. But I would caution, and Francesco will know this well, that projecting exchange rates is probably one of the most difficult things for economists to do. And we consistently get that wrong more than almost anything else. So at best, I try to be wrong in a consistent fashion rather than simply consistently wrong. I would say that, based on productivity differences between the two countries, we do continue to see fair value for the Canadian dollar at somewhere just north of 80 cents. And so over time, as the economic outlook normalizes, we should expect to see the Canadian dollar strengthen gradually over time. But for the moment, for the forecast horizon we are anticipating something closer to the low 70s.
I appreciate you. I may use that phrase, that turn of phrase. MP Sorbara, in the time we have left, I'm going to see if I can pepper you with a few quick questions that we received online. And I would just say that if we don't know all the answers, we can always get back to them in the future. Some of these are fairly specific. So one of the ones we received is, when will the new eligibility criteria for the emergency business loan be announced?
The criteria actually has already been announced. The new criteria for the CEBA has already been announced. I believe the portal is not yet open. I could be mistaken on that, but the criteria has already been announced in terms of the ability to use dividends, the ability to the level of expenses that you'll need to demonstrate, which will be $40,000, and the requirement that to have filed either a 2018, 2019 income tax return. The one thing that has not, the detail that has not been yet determined, but I know Minister Ng has referred to this, is the ability for businesses that did not use a business account within its primary financial institution. They used a personal account to conduct their businesses. That is the last tweak, or they should be the last tweak in terms of expanding the eligibility of the CABA. We're still waiting for details on that one.
Okay, thank you. Will the wage subsidy program policy be amended to allow employers of small, medium-sized businesses who hire contractors and non-employees yearly to apply?
I'll have to get back onto that one. That's some great feedback. I can provide that back to the department. I can't answer that at this time. I know the CEWS program is something that over 100, and I think we're up to 150,000 or plus employers have utilized. covering nearly 2 million workers in Canada. So we are seeing some very, very robust uptake of the program. Obviously, it was a program that I know the CFIB, the Vaughan Chamber, the Chamber of Commerce in Canada, there was a lot of strong advocacy done to put the program in place. Great to see it roll out. If we get a lot of feedback and pass it on, and we can make some tweaks to improve the program, we're always willing to do that.
I got two more quick ones. One is, again, let's see if we're able to answer this.
Sure.
There was one business says we missed the eligibility for the emergency business loan due to a technicality that they changed banks. They changed the new bank after March 1st. So they just said, should we apply again, or is there another program we should apply to?
There is the Regional Recovery Fund program that's being run out of FedDev. It's about $230 million. And that program, not a lot of people know about that program. It seems a lot of stakeholders. That program really captures all the businesses, or a majority of businesses that weren't able to get any of the other programs put in place by the federal government, a loan from BDC or EDC, CEBA loan. So there is that avenue. But I think in this particular case, I would actually go back to, if I was a business, I would go directly to this primary financial institution, speak to the person who's in charge of their account, explain to them the situation. If they meet the other thresholds, then they should be allowed into the program, whether they've switched or not switched financial institutions. I don't know if they've switched to Scotiabank, Brett. I can't tell you that, but we'll see.
Well, if they had switched to Scotiabank, of course, it would behoove me to say they'd be richer than they thought.
Right. Okay, MP Sorbara, I got one more for you. I'm going to come back to Brett for final question, and then we're going to wrap it up. The reopening, we haven't really talked about the reopening much on this segment. We've spent a lot of time on it in previous segments. So reopening of businesses really lies under provincial jurisdiction. What is the federal government's role in that process? Does it need to evolve?
So the way the Canadian Constitution has been constructed, they're obviously a division of jurisdictional powers. Some industries do fall under the federal government's watch: banking, telecom, transportation. Those are generally governed under our watch. And I say transportation, rails, and airlines. It is really in part largely the responsibility of the local governments, what I call provincial governments, in terms of opening up. And you're seeing this across the board, whether it's in Europe, in Italy, for example, the regions versus the central government; in the United States, the states versus the federal government; and here in Canada, the provinces opening up a bit at different paces. What I would like to see, I know the numbers are out this morning. We have a big uptick in the number of tests done in Ontario, over 15,000, which is great to see. And the number of new cases remain for the second day below 300. What we need, is, as the Prime Minister has commented, a lot of testing, the ability to trace, and for people to, for the time being, do social distancing and make sure that's important. That if we can get that, we can get our economy up and running as quickly as possible and safely. Obviously, the social distancing for restaurants, we're going to have to work on that to allow restaurants and hospitality, which we know is so important to the economy and employs so many thousands of workers, or tens of thousands of workers across, hundreds of thousands of workers across Canada, to get that up and running as well. So those are my thoughts on that part.
Thank you. And last question to Brett. Just it's similar theme as what we just talked to with MP Sorbara. Is we're anticipating a second wave for COVID. How will the Canadian economy need to prepare and adapt should there be a second wave, both from a fiscal and monetary policy perspective?
Even in the first wave that we're still experiencing, almost everything we say about the economic outlook and the policies that need to accompany it are really byproducts of the public health outlook and the efforts and the effectiveness of them to control, contain, and eliminate the pandemic. And so almost anything I would say about the economics is really contingent upon the public health situation. And so they're testing, tracing, follow-up, maintaining physical distancing, and remaining sustainable in terms of the things you're already doing and intensifying them to keep the pandemic under control are going to be the critical determinants of how we do economically. We know from research on the Spanish flu back in 1918 and subsequent pandemics that the countries that do shut down and implement strict control measures are the ones that end up rebounding more quickly, that are able to reopen more effectively and comprehensively. And I know that that sounds awfully tough right now when particularly small and medium-sized businesses, I think, rightly feel like they're being sacrificed to our public health control measures. But we know from past experience in the data that the pain up front is what allows us to get to the gains more quickly later on. But to do that and to ensure that that pain is distributed in an equitable fashion, we do need to ensure that government hears from you and is able to adjust the support measures that they put into place. So it's not just, you know, the big boxes, the huge online retailers, the companies that can move to working remotely that survive, but everyone gets through this together. And banks as well, you know, whether it's deferrals on mortgages, business loans, or other restructurings, are there to work with you. And if they're not doing so effectively, they need to hear from you.
Agreed. Well, I wanted to sincerely thank you both. We are at a time. Many of our viewers end up seeing this segment later on. It'll be posted. So I thought there was a lot of topics we covered and a lot of great answers, and appreciate how candid you both were. I want to give a shout out to Render Media. They're in the background for the Vaughan Chamber. They're doing our live webcasting. That's our live webcasting partner, as well as the City of Vaughan, VBEC, Vaughan Business Enterprise Centre. They've been supporting us through these series, so I want to give them a shout out. Remind those at home, if you have questions or concerns about what's going on, please reach out to the Chamber. You can join our mailing list on our website as well if that helps you stay connected. And just thank sincerely Brett House, Vice President, Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank. And I appreciate you brought in a little bit, both of you brought in a little bit of levity throughout this segment as well. And MP Sorbara for Vaughan Woodbridge, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue. And I look forward to, I'm sure we'll see you again soon, MP Sorbara, and Brett, you're welcome back anytime, and wish you both to stay safe and healthy, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Brian, as always. Thank you.
My pleasure. Hopefully in person eventually.
Absolutely.